I'm going to start with inviting Dr. Wilkie to share a few things about her for the audience to appreciate who she is and why she's in this work. And specifically, we're going to invite her to give us a bit of an overview about what a clinical trial generally is, what it typically involves. So Dr. Wilkie, I'm going to hand the mic to you first.
It would help after 3 years of using Zoom that I knew how to come off of mute. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Kevin, as well as Dr. Vivian for joining us today to talk about clinical trials in general, as well as the specifics of this breast cancer vaccine trial. So I am a surgical oncologist. I am trained as a general surgeon and have focused more recently in my career in the last 10 to 15 years, primarily on breast cancer. And it is an honor and a privilege to take care of breast cancer patients. Every day in the clinic, we face what is called clinical equipoise, where a patient comes in because every patient is unique and has their own background, history, exposures, both family history, as well as exposures out in the environment, that makes them a unique individual with a new diagnosis of cancer. And within the cancer world, we have spent a lot of time as providers and patients contributing to the science behind what we should be doing in this space, because patients have agreed to clinical trials. And when we say, what is a clinical trial? We are asking questions about, are there better treatments for this disease? In my world of surgery, I first learned about clinical trials when I actually operated on my first patient as a resident. Residency in surgery takes about 7 years. They don't let us just go off and do this on our own. But one of the first patients I operated on was a woman with breast cancer, and I was doing what was called a lumpectomy. Back then, I actually did what was called an axillary dissection, which means remove all of the lymph nodes under their arm. Fortunately, in the last 25 years, we've learned that we no longer need to do that operation because of clinical trials that informed a better way of identifying those lymph nodes so that we only had to take out a few of them. But what I learned is that the reason the woman could have a lumpectomy is because a group of women back in the 1970s agreed to a clinical trial that randomized one group of them to lumpectomy, or removing part of the breast, and the other group to what had been the standard, mastectomy, or removing the whole breast. And we learned back in the 70s and 80s that it was safe to do that, i.e. just remove part of the breast. And since that time, there have been hundreds of clinical trials, testing new drugs, testing new surgeries, testing new ways of doing radiation. And this is true across a whole compendium of cancers, whether it's lung cancer, gastric cancer, which is stomach cancer, pancreas cancer, or colon or prostate cancer. Clinical trials have helped informed and helped both the patients, their families, and providers learn what's better. Is there something better or not? In fact, bone marrow transplantation was tested back in the, and don't quote me on this, 80s or 90s in breast cancer, and it was discovered it was not an approach for treating breast cancer. And we thank every patient who participates in a clinical trial, whether it's a survey about your experiences, what we call patient-reported outcomes, or whether it's truly testing a new treatment versus an old treatment. I will say nowadays it's very rare, it's infrequent, that we're testing a new treatment versus nothing. It's infrequent that we do that, though occasionally it happens. It's usually a new treatment or an addition to an existing treatment. And there are different phases of clinical trials. I'll give you just a quick little introduction. Phase 1 means that we're testing, is it safe? Usually it's a new drug, it can be a new surgery, but is it safe? And usually those are not randomized because you're just picking patients who are very willing to try something new, but we don't know yet if it's safe. Phase 2 is really to look at efficacy. Does it make a difference in a small population? And then phase 3 is testing it in a large population. Do we see a survival benefit in cancer? Do we see a recurrence benefit in cancer? Do we see a true large-scale benefit in a population that we should be using this treatment instead of the old treatment? And the reason I got involved in clinical trials was early on as a resident, I was intrigued by the fact that, boy, we should be testing almost everything we do, whether it's a new surgery, a new drug, a new radiation, a new way of treating diabetes, which is Dr. Vivian's expertise. And she's got great expertise in clinical research, understanding what's happening in our populations. And I think I had that bug early on as a resident, and it has continued to this day, where I've been involved with national groups in helping design clinical trials at a national level. And I find it very rewarding to be in those discussions about what we call clinical equipoise. Is there truly a question, or is there a need to just evaluate a large population versus ask the question of drug A or surgery A versus surgery B? It's very important to go through that exercise and process and involve patients in it. One of the most rewarding things that I've seen happen over the last 25 years is we've started to create patient advocates. Patients are being trained in understanding the science behind what is done, and then giving a true voice into what's happening. And I think that's a fabulous addition, because it's always amazing when you finish writing a clinical trial and then have a patient advocacy group review it. They're like, we can't do that. What are you thinking? And that's the most important part about it. So switching just for a second to the breast cancer vaccine trial, as a bit of a background, the University of Wisconsin Carbone Cancer Center is part of what's called a consortium. It's a consortium led or funded by the National Cancer Institute, and it's a group of universities and centers across the United States who work together on cancer prevention. Cancer prevention has been infrequently evaluated and funded. Usually it's once you're diagnosed with cancer, we focus a lot of clinical trials and evaluation in that space. But the prevention space is a little less focused on, and this consortium allows us to do that. And there is a fabulous medical oncologist and researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle, the other UW. Her name is Dr. Nora Disis. She is a vaccine development expert. She has developed vaccines for a type of breast cancer that has a feature called HER2. And in the last several years has developed a vaccine using newer technology for what's called triple negative breast cancer. Remember, breast cancer is unique to every human who has it. Unless you're an identical twin, your cancer doesn't look like anyone else's. It's not like a virus. It's not like a bacteria. It's unique to you. But we categorize breast cancers and other cancers, gastric cancers, esophageal cancers, by their features. And there is a breast cancer type called triple negative, which means it doesn't like hormones, it doesn't like estrogen, and it doesn't have that extra feature called HER2. So we label it triple negative because the three main markers are negative. And usually a triple negative breast cancer patient, as somebody once told me about 15 years ago, they got slashed, that's surgery, burned, that's radiation, and poisoned, that's chemo. And so we've worked hard to make sure it's not slashing, burning, and poisoning. But we don't have a lot of preventative approaches to stop that cancer from coming back. The hormone sensitive cancers, we can give an anti-hormone drug, but the triple negative cancers, we don't have anything in our back pocket to kind of prevent it from coming back. So Dr. Disis developed this triple negative vaccine that targets 6 what's called epitopes or features of a stem cell that can be associated with these cancers. And it was tested in a phase 1 study, and it was safe. So those patients, it was safe. There was minimal side effects, minimal problems, and so it was deemed to be safe. And now we're doing a phase 2 trial, and I am quite honored that it was our consortium that was selected to do this trial by the NCI. And we are working with the University of Washington in Seattle and Johns Hopkins to identify patients who've had triple negative breast cancer who want to participate in something that we don't know whether it's going to prevent their cancer from coming back. It's still a question, but we know it's safe to do it. And now we're going to look at what's called the efficacy. Does the patient, when they get the vaccine, mount an immune response? Does their immune system rev up so that when a new cancer cell shows up, those immune cells go and attack it and kill it? That's a very simplistic view of this, I will have you know. There is T cells and immune responses that are involved with all this, but what we're looking for, and I'm sure Dr. Vivian will highlight how much blood has been drawn during this trial. We are looking for that immune response. Is her body responding to the vaccine? Because if we can show in a large number of patients that's happening, then we get to move to the phase 3 and open it up to a large number of patients. So one final key point, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Vivian because I've already spoken probably too much, is why is it important that a diverse population participates in these trials? Cancer is unique to the person who has it. And every population of people, female, male, non-binary, African-American, Hispanic, Caucasian, all get cancer. No one's immune. And so if we don't have a diverse population participating in these clinical trials, we won't know who they work in. It is so important that we see a triple negative cancer in an African-American individual has probably a different background than somebody who's of a Swedish Northern European background. We know that actually from studies looking at the differences in these cancers when you actually go to populations from Africa, from Northern Europe, from China, from India. And so if we don't have people participating in these trials, we won't know who they work in effectively. And unfortunately, the generalizability, which I think is a very important term, is limited. And so we have to make sure we remove any barriers. There's this slide that goes around talking about equity and equitable and has people standing on chairs and looking over fences. And I actually just saw the best slide where the fence was removed. Because that's the way it should be, is we should make this available to anyone. Now understand, eligibility for the trial is a key piece of this. We are not giving pregnant patients this vaccine. We don't know its safety in pregnancy. And so we don't know the safety in somebody who has uncontrolled diabetes. We don't know the safety in somebody who is on high dose anti-inflammatories because of their rheumatoid arthritis. So there are pieces of the puzzle that should be unique to different diseases, but not to the patient's background. So I've talked a lot, Sarah. Have I missed any of our points?
You talked just the right amount, and I want to acknowledge a couple of things that you did that I think are really important to highlight. First, thank you for the context of how the trial landed here, for recognizing your colleagues, both in the consortium and also the developer, Dr. Nora.
Desus.
Yep. Thank you. I also want to appreciate so much you acknowledging the / burned and poisoned. This is startling to ears that maybe haven't heard that reference before, but it's quite common in the work that I do with different communities and neighbors who just really have felt had a jarring experience trying to navigate and understand this very technical world. And I'm so appreciative also that you broke down some of the features, because it's no joke that you've been at this for decades, and you managed to use some language that I think is a bit more accessible, while also understanding there's lots to learn on each of these plateaus. So thank you so much for those features. And yes, just a plug for the efforts underway to assist patients and families with navigating health systems, cancer diagnosis and otherwise. There is a growing group of professionals lending voice and support to families and patients who may be reticent to step into different medical homes and figure out this journey. They should not be alone in that, and we're prepared to support them. I can think of no greater spokesperson than our next speaker, Dr. Vivian, who so appreciate your willingness to step into this space and talk a little bit about the experience. And I'll similarly ask you to sort of consider how you came to be here, the particular role that you're playing today, and we look so forward to hearing more about your experiences. Thank you, Dr. Vivian.
Well, thank you for inviting me today. It's really an honor and privilege to be here to share my experience as a breast cancer survivor. I met Dr. Wilkie a little over 3 years ago, shortly after I received an annual mammogram. And unfortunately, that mammogram showed an unusual mass in my breast. And I have a family history of breast cancer. And Dr. Wilkie was an incredible surgical oncologist. I mean, she has an incredible reputation in the African American community. And I think that this is what gave me some comfort. She was actually referred to me from Dr. Gloria Lanson Billings, who spoke of her reputation within the community. So I think that all healthcare survivors, healthcare providers should really strive to have that type of reputation in underserved communities, particularly among groups that have faced historical trauma within the healthcare system. But I'd like to go back and talk a little bit about my history with breast cancer. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was in grade school. I was in the 5th grade when I learned my mother had breast cancer. And at that time, the only treatment for breast cancer was a mastectomy. So as Dr. Wilkie indicated earlier, it was so difficult for my mother. And as she indicated, that clinical trials have really helped us in managing breast cancer. I thought of my mother often during my treatment, and I realized that it was because of people, women who volunteered to endure the harsh treatment of chemotherapy. If any of you have experienced chemotherapy, it's not a fun experience at all. And these are, I would argue, the harshest drugs on the market. And there were healthy women that volunteered to take these drugs to see if they were safe. So their contribution to this science was really vital, and it helped women like myself. So moving fast forward, Dr. Wilkie provided me with great information about a year ago that I was breast cancer free. And I celebrated my 3rd year of being free from cancer. And she invited me to participate in the STEMVAC study. And I felt an obligation to do this because of the sacrifice that my mother made, but also I knew that it would help so many women in the future. Just the idea of a vaccine that could prevent breast cancer, and breast cancer one day being comparable to smallpox, which is unheard of. And I hope that I'm alive to see that day happen. So I'm very proud to be the first recipient of the vaccine.
Eva, thank you so much for putting into perspective how you landed here, not just today, but sort of on this pathway. As you think back to what you were considering about participation in the trial, can you share with us a little bit about sort of what you were expecting to have happen, and then maybe reflect a little bit after that about, did it go as you expected, or were there unexpected parts to this? Just to help some of our audience appreciate the common experience we all have when we're going into something that's part of a clinical trial and a bit unproven, right? There's a lot of information you're expected to be handed and understand. And then we have our own ideas about sort of what it's going to be like. So would you do a little thinking back on that, on those 2 points?
Absolutely. I guess I'm an unusual participant because I do have a background in research. And while my research is community-based, when I graduated from pharmacy school, I did work in clinical trials. So I was very familiar with clinical trials. So when Dr. Wilkie invited me to participate in this study, I anticipated that I would receive the vaccine and that I would be asked a lot of questions about side effects associated with the vaccine. I didn't anticipate that they would request a half a pint of blood at each visit, but it wasn't something that I was bothered by. I have to say that I wasn't really surprised by anything, but it's partly because of my background as a clinical pharmacist that I was prepared. What I will add to this is that it's very important to get diverse subjects and the subjects from diverse backgrounds in studies. And that's why it's really important that healthcare providers build strong relationships with patients. Sometimes we underestimate how important that is. But we found out very recently, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic, that there were so many people that did not want to receive the vaccine. And these were individuals that weren't anti-vaxxers. These people received other vaccines, but they were hesitant to receive the COVID vaccine because of their mistrust of the healthcare system. And a lot of that stemmed from the treatment that they received within the system. So we as healthcare providers have to be that trusted messenger that patients feel comfortable working with and reaching out to when they have questions. And I think that that will make people from underserved communities more likely to participate in clinical trials.
Sarah, can I add on to your question for Dr.
Please, please.
So participating in a clinical trial is additive. It is additive to their standard of care, and it's additive and should not impact their standard of care. So Dr. Vivian still gets her routine follow-ups and cancer follow-ups, and the participation in the clinical trial is extra. As a result, it's extra time and extra effort, and we recognize that, and it's an important point to make sure that when you're participating in a trial that perhaps isn't just comparing drug A to drug B, where you might be getting drug A and drug B and it's at the same time. Sometimes a clinical trial is extra time. And because of Dr. Vivian's experience, I now tell patients who are participating in this trial, hey, you know, when you go give blood, we're kind of going to be doing that when we are drawing the blood for this trial. So I'm giving them that expectation, which is more than I think we gave Eva because we didn't really fully understand it. So we do learn during the clinical trial how to educate patients around it. And it's extra time to come in and get the vaccine and then tell us what does the site look like? How did you feel? Did you feel bad afterwards? It is extra work, and we work very hard as providers when you design the trial to make sure that we make it as user-friendly as possible, but sometimes that's not always easy. And that's why engaging with the patient and family advisors and council members is important to say, how can we get this down to the bare minimum of extra that's going to be needed? Dr. Vivian, do you want to comment on kind of the extras involved?
Okay, absolutely. It does take a great deal of time. Usually I spend between 4 to 6 hours on the days that I receive the vaccine. So patients have to understand that this is time out of their day, that they will have to inform their employer that they'll be absent. There are some side effects associated with receiving the vaccine. I think everyone who is viewing this program have received the COVID-19 vaccine, and they're usually flu-like symptoms. After my first dose of the vaccine, I had symptoms maybe 5 hours after receiving the dose, but those symptoms only lasted for 4 to 5 hours. 1 month later, when I received the second dose, those symptoms occurred immediately after receiving the vaccine and lasted 8 hours. But when I returned the third month for the third dose, I had no symptoms. It's very interesting. And a few months later, when I received the first booster, there was no side effects. I think it's important to inform patients that they should keep a diary of any side effects that may occur. And I made that recommendation to the research team, because if you are asking someone about side effects a month later, then it's very likely that they may forget some of the side effects that they did experience.
And what an excellent point, Eva. The diary is not something, we may have kept it when we were in our teens, but it's not something we remember to do now with all of our electronics. So thank you. What a fabulous addition. And this trial is different than other trials. Some trials don't require extra time outside of clinic visits that are expected, and sometimes they do. One other question I wanted to add is, I'm not the only one involved in this clinical trial. We have a team that is just absolutely fabulous. The team that is what's called clinical research coordinators. And Beatrice is one of our clinical research coordinators. And then one of our leads, Kim, really help make sure that we are dotting our I's, crossing our T's, doing everything we're supposed to do to be safe and make sure we monitor and determine how well this vaccine is working. So Eva, do you want to comment on the other people you interact with and kind of thought, because it's not just the providers.
That's true. The research team has been really helpful. I enjoy working with Kim Mass and Beatrice, who contacts me and reminds me of my appointment. And she's very nice. She will meet me in the entrance area to ensure that I find the right location. I recall my first appointment, I got lost. I mean, there's some areas of UW Hospital that are like a maze, and I got lost. So Kim immediately suggested that going forward, that they greet all the participants at the entrance of the hospital so they can find their way to the research area.
Thank you both for this exchange. I want to make a couple of points, and then I have a few questions to ask both of you that relate to the conversation. But Eva, I just want to thank you again for pointing out the importance of the person who referred you and the naming of Dr. Wilkie as a trusted source and amplify that is so commonly my experience also in terms of the who's doing that kind of endorsing and referral, and how important it is to recognize that and seek to learn more about what's going on there so that others can emulate that kind of referral. But also, I think, Dr. Wilkie, you mentioned patient family advocates. So this is a feature at UW Health. There are many PFAs, or patient family advocates. Some of them work independently to give back to the health system about the experiences that they've had. Some of them join councils that are around different areas of care, including cancer care. I also just wanted to lift up the sort of interactive exchange you're having with participants along the way to not just learn about their personal response to the drug, but the experience, the whole experience. So I love hearing about, I'm sure Lucretia Sullivan-Wade, who's in our audience, is probably smiling too. She has accompanied many a person through the maze. And that is no small thing that PFAs have lent insight to the system about. This makes the journey harder if you aren't thinking about the experience from the time I pull up to do my parking to the time I drive away. So appreciate so much those features.
I can't fix parking at UW.
You know, you can't, but there are creative means. We have creative means. We'll talk. So thank you so much. A couple more questions in our minutes before we open this up to our audience. And again, audience, please feel free to put things in the chat or the Q&A if you haven't. But specific to the vaccine trial and breast cancer research, can each of you share a little bit about what's next for you, kind of what's in the immediate as far as looking forward on this innovative opportunity? Anything you want to add?
Sure, just adding in that this is the world of cancer vaccines is been in the background for many years. Convincing an immune system to fight a cancer cell and not fight a normal cell is difficult. We don't want to create an autoimmune disorder because remember, your cancer cells are not dramatically different than your normal cells. They're somewhat, but not dramatically. And so the world of cancer vaccines has been a constant area of research, and it's just now getting to the point that we think it's ready for quote unquote prime time. And that's why we're starting to see it and starting to see more clinical trials with this work. I think we're very excited that we had the first patient on and kind of beat UW and Johns Hopkins to the punch. I'll claim that. And I can't thank Dr. Vivian enough for doing that because being the first is always hard. And I think we're learning as we're going, and we're hoping when we finish the accrual of 33 patients, so this trial is open to 33 patients across the 3 sites, we then need to follow them and get them to that year point. So this trial is 3 injections a month apart, then a 6-month booster and a 12-month booster. So we've got to get all 33 patients to that 1-year spot and then be analyzing all the blood. So what I look forward to is about 1.5 to 2 years from now, the results. And then getting to share those results with patients. That's something new, and that's something Eva won't know her specific results, but she'll know the group's results. And that, I think, is an important piece of the puzzle that we haven't always circled back to the participants, and we're starting to do that. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. Dr. Vivian, your thoughts on that?
Well, at this point, I am just waiting for the 12-month booster.
She's going to be the first one that gets the 12-month booster.
Yes, but it's been important to me to be the first participant because triple negative breast cancer affects African American women at disproportionate rates. And I think it was very important for me to be the first patient to receive this vaccine because I feel that it might put other African American women who develop this kind of cancer at ease and may increase their willingness to participate, not just in this type of clinical trial, but other clinical trials in the future. African Americans have historically had bad experiences in clinical research. And because of that, there's a lot of hesitancy to participate in this type of research. But if we don't participate now, then we won't know how drugs impact us as a group. So it's important going forward that we become involved with clinical trials and actually be willing to work with the healthcare providers to collect this type of data that can actually provide treatment for not just breast cancer, but other diseases as well.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Our chat is lighting up, so we are going to transition a bit. Does that, I see Kevin just came on. Yes, good with that decision, sir?
Yes, we do have quite a few questions. So I will kick it off. First question is this vaccine an mRNA vaccine?
Great question. No, this is what's called a DNA vaccine. So the mRNA vaccine world came to light with COVID. And I do think we will see that technology starting to permeate into the cancer vaccine world. However, this is what's called a DNA vaccine. It is designed to rev up what's called your CD4 T cells or your white cells. And it is designed against, as I may have mentioned before, 6 epitopes that are part of kind of stemness. Triple negative cancers are what are commonly sometimes called basal type cancers. They have a very premature appearance. They're kind of, and this is a terrible analogy, kind of like teenagers that have lost their frontal lobe in a major way and just don't know where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to do. And the vaccine is designed to kind of create T cells or an in-check system to bring them back in line and prevent them from growing and prevent them from leaving the house and expanding. So it is a DNA-based plasmid vaccine.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wilkie. Next question is, do you think that a choice between doing mastectomy or lumpectomy is different based on the age of the woman diagnosed? Nowadays, age of women that are diagnosed with cancer is starting younger, much younger these days.
So actually just an epidemiological study, the number of younger women with breast cancer has not changed dramatically in about the last 30 to 40 years. It may have slightly increased, but it hasn't been a dramatic change. What we're seeing is the baby boomers aging up. And so we have more breast cancer only because that population is a larger population. Younger women, when they get breast cancer, it can be more aggressive. And African American women get breast cancer younger. So actually, the new screening recommendations are very important to us because we recognize that different populations get breast cancer at different times based on their genetic background, whether it's an African American background or a mixed background or a purely European background. There are different time frames that we expect to see breast cancer in these patient populations. And in the African American one, it's younger. So we need to be screening and paying attention younger in that group of individuals. Now, the mastectomy versus lumpectomy, they are equivalent survival-wise, no matter what age you are. They are different based on genetics. And so there's an importance to incorporate genetics into that background. If you're born with something that causes breast cancer, which more younger women are, then we have a different conversation about the pros and cons of breast conservation or lumpectomy versus mastectomy. But a lot of good data showing it's equivalent survival-wise.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of talk about decentralized clinical trials these days. Do you think the move towards decentralized clinical trials will facilitate giving access to more diverse populations in clinical research? And what's the role of academic health centers in that process? I'd
actually love Dr. Vivian to comment on this. She does community clinical research. how do we get clinical trials out into communities? And how do we, what's so hard is we have to make sure clinical trials are safe. We have to. So how do we get the people who understand the safety out into those communities to make sure that if we're giving a vaccine out in the community or giving a new drug out in the community, that we have a backup for that safety approach? And would love Dr. Vivian's thoughts on this.
Wow, that's a very good question. I think what is key is to build those trusted relationships in the community. There are several people within the community that are regarded as community leaders that could assist with this effort. And during the pandemic, we had an initiative where there were many programs offered at local African-American churches and community centers. And these community centers and churches had strong relationships with healthcare facilities. For example, Ms. LaQuisha Wade has a strong relationship with Access Community Health Centers. And I think that could be a mechanism where we could engage in clinical trials and involve community members and ensure a level of safety, because there could be relationships and connections between UW Health and Access Community Health Centers, as well as the local community centers.
I'll just expand a little bit on that. UW is actually now part and became and received one of, and don't quote me on this, between 30 and 40 sites around the country, a PCORI grant, so that when new clinical trials or new clinical research comes up and we may be interested in it, for example, one that we just were looking at was about prostate cancer. We don't know if we're going to participate. We were just asked to look at it and consider it. But our charge is to make sure that we get those clinical trials out into the community. And how are we going to do that? And what mechanisms are we going to do that through? And so the grant is actually to say, what processes do you have to get this out into the community, not what the trial is. It's actually an interesting approach, which I like. And a lot of them won't be cancer. Some will be, childhood vaccines and other things, but it's how do we get what we do out into the community in a more efficacious manner? How do we make clinical trials simple, quote unquote, keep it simple, which is called the KISS principle, so that many people can participate. And if it does require that they come to an academic center, we make sure the transportation and the process and meeting them at the door is there.
Okay, I'd like to add on that is very important, and thank you for mentioning that. All too often, we expect people from within the community to travel to community hospitals and clinics. And many people within communities have to work during the day, and they don't have the benefit of being able to take a day off to spend time at a clinic or hospital to participate in a clinical trial or even to receive medical care. So I think it's important that we develop ways to make services accessible to people that may have limited resources or other responsibilities, such as working during business hours.
Yeah, the working during business hours is such an interesting approach. And how do we shift a little bit to make sure we can do that early morning or afternoon? It's hard on everyone, but it is something we need to be thinking about.
Thank you both. Another question is, will this vaccine apply to other breast cancers?
Great question. Most vaccines, I liken this a little bit to the flu vaccine. Sometimes when we all get the flu vaccine, the flu that happens that year wasn't in the vaccine. So we can't predict, it didn't work quite right. And sometimes it works really well. For cancers, they're unique to the individual. And if we had a perfect world, you would get a vaccine made for your cancer. Like if we could make the flu vaccine for the exact flu you're going to get, then you won't get the flu. The same would be true for cancer. This vaccine is only for triple negative cancers. That's how it was designed. It's not designed for estrogen positive cancers. There's a lot of work in vaccines for HER2 positive cancers. The estrogen positive cancers have a lot more heterogeneity, and creating vaccines for them will be a little bit more difficult, but I'm sure it's on the radar at some point. You want to get the vaccine technology down a little bit with the cancers you think will respond to a vaccine, and then expand it to the more heterogeneous group. I hope that made sense.
Next question is, could this eliminate the need for hormonal treatment like, and I hope I don't mess this up, aromatase inhibitors?
No, and that's exactly, if we could get vaccines either individualized or for specific types of cancer, yes, we would hope we would reduce the medications we have to use. But right now, the triple negative cancers don't have aromatase inhibitors. They don't have drugs that prevent them from getting their cancers back. So this vaccine is kind of what we call secondary prevention.
Thank you. Can a man develop breast cancer?
Yes, about 1% of breast cancers across the United States are in men and worldwide. I shouldn't be exclusive. That usually present at later stages. It's very important for men to still be kind of chest wall breast aware, because they usually present with a much larger mass and it's later stage, because they may not have recognized that cancer was possible in men.
Dr. Wilkie, do you anticipate that eligibility to receive this vaccine will be expanded if results from the phase 2 trial and beyond are favorable? For example, could this vaccine eventually be given to individuals with genetic mutations for the breast cancer gene as a preventative treatment?
Such a great question. They're all great questions, but this is what we call secondary prevention, as I just mentioned it. People who've had triple negative cancer, giving them the vaccine to prevent it from coming back. Several individuals in this trial have genetic mutations, but they've had cancer as well. This will then go to a phase 3 trial in secondary prevention. But if it functions very well, then yes, could you imagine, if it's safe enough, to give to people who've never had cancer as primary prevention? And the groups you would focus on would be those that are high risk of developing triple negative breast cancer, which would be individuals with a genetic mutation, or I'm always surprised, there are families of African-American women, you know, just amazing grandmother, mother, sister, who've all had triple negative breast cancer, but they don't have a gene. They must have a gene we don't know about.
Mhm.
That kind of population is where you would want primary prevention. And I'll answer I see the diary question.
Oh yeah, great.
Yes. Eva was fabulous at keeping a diary, and we have other patients who've done the same, and we can't thank them enough. But you're right. You know, when you did your COVID vaccine, you could have signed up to do your diary to kind of send in the information as to whether you had side effects or not. We wish we had an app like that. Developing that actually takes some work. And so, yes, in the future, we would love to have it in the smartphone, but remembering if we could just hand them a simple little, you know, nice leather bound diary that they could answer into, that's just as helpful. And so I do think apps in the future are linked to clinical trials. We'd like to, yes.
And then it looks like the final question for now is any genetic testing of persons participating in this clinical trial anticipated in later phases?
Many people who participate, go ahead, Eva, do you want to answer?
Oh, no, I was going to comment that when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I actually underwent genetic testing. So that occurred before I was treated. And I was tested for the breast cancer gene, which I was negative.
So most of the women in this study have been genetically tested. Some are positive and some are negative. That is actually one of our desires for diversity, is to have some that are genetically negative, but have family history, and some that are genetically positive. So we have sought that kind of diversity in this trial. So usually these women have been tested. If they haven't, and they should have been, we have offered it.
Okay, if I'll just give a few more seconds if anybody else has any questions. That's the, oh, here we go. How do I find out about future clinical trials involving breast cancer vaccines?
Oh my God, such a great question. So keeping up websites that are up to date on clinical trials, I'm sure Kevin and Sarah can reiterate this, is sometimes hard. So individual institutional websites, it's hard to keep up with when they close, when they start, and somebody's got to constantly be monitoring it. But nationally, we are required to post any clinical trial that we do on what's called clinicaltrials.gov. And you can go to that website, and we have some of this on our website, but I will confess that at times trying to keep it up to date is difficult. And our UW Clinical Trials Institute will have one as well. But I remind people that clinicaltrials.gov is a great website. You can search by Wisconsin, you can search by state, you can search by cancer type. So you can put in your search criteria and it should show up. So I advise people that if they're interested in looking up a clinical trial and you just want to know what's in our area, just put our state. And that will always be the most up to date, though our institutional websites, whether it's us or regional areas, we try and keep up. Usually we link you to the clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Wilkie, and I would like to put a plug in for the Institute as well. If people do have questions about any of those clinical trials that are out there, or the Carbone Cancer Center, obviously it would be a great resource. I know some of those listings on clinicaltrials.gov can be a little daunting from a from a technical language standpoint.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if there might be other resources that that folks could reach out to if they do have questions about some of the trials that are listed there.
Sure, and we actually here in the Cancer Center, we have this amazing group of clinical trial navigators. It's a group of nurses who have been trained in both clinical trials and kind of navigation, understanding eligibility, understanding what type of clinical trial you might be eligible for. And so I would put a plug in. We have a clinical trials navigator office. I'd have to look up the phone number and I apologize. I believe it's on the Carbone Cancer Center website. I'm almost 100% certain of that. And if you look up the clinical trial navigation office, we should be able to get you to them. But they are really good at helping navigate people through this process.
Thank you so much. We've had a couple other questions come in. Is this vaccine only for African-American women who are triple negative?
No, it's all women with triple negative breast cancer. We recognize it is a higher prevalence in the African-American community. So we would like individuals from that community to participate, but it's available to anyone with a triple negative cancer, understanding there are other eligibility criteria. You have to be within 3 years of your last treatment for the cancer. As Eva highlighted, she was just at nearing that 3-year mark.
Thank you. And I want to point out in the chat that the contact information for the Clinical Trials Navigation Office has been added. And we'll be sure to include that information in the follow-up email that we sent out after the event as well.
Yeah, thank you to Sarah Cotillo for putting that in. She is our leader of the Clinical Trials Navigation Office. I didn't want to call out, she has a team of fabulous individuals and is, as we move forward with both the UW Clinical Trials Institute and within the Cancer Center, we have a lot of really great integration between our clinical care and clinical trials groups going forward.
Great. It looks like we have a comment that the Breast Cancer Research Advisory Network is looking for more survivors, and they have a website as well. Just want to, we've got a few more questions here. 3 years within treatment, does that include immunotherapy?
Yes, it does. So it's okay. And that's a very specific question, but I fortunately could help answer it. The eligibility is end of active treatment. And if you were on a year of immunotherapy, your end of active treatment is at the end of that immunotherapy. I will say, and I don't want to be negative, we are currently on a little bit of a hold with this trial, only because the vaccine makers couldn't keep up with us. We had so many people interested in this trial, and it requires 3 injections, 6 months and 1 year. We have to have enough vaccine for the person once they enroll, and they're struggling to make it fast enough. It's a temporary hold, but it's just while they catch up in making the vaccine, because Eva has to have hers. We've reserved hers.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah. So once they enroll, we have enough vaccine, but we can't enroll new people if we don't have enough vaccine.
And Dr. Wilkie, how many participants have enrolled at UW-Madison?
Oh, boy. We have 18 or 19 nationwide. Vast majority are here. 11 or 12? 12 here, maybe?
And how many are African American?
I don't know the specifics of that just yet. We will. We push it out to everybody and encourage everyone. And we've hopefully been pushing it out to large communities but I don't look at the exact numbers because that's kind of looking at the data too early. But
okay.
We've had a lot of great questions come in. I want to make sure that we didn't miss any. So if we did miss your question, please take a few moments to retype it if you don't mind. So I'll just give that a few seconds here to see if we have any other
lots of
questions.
thanks to Dr. Vivian for sharing her story. I will say it's not easy to be out there talking about it. It's not easy to reveal that you've had a cancer diagnosis. Some people don't want to do that. And we thank Eva for doing this. It's a decision she made. In fact, when I first introduced, as she said, the trial to her, she said, I need to do this for the community. And that is just such a selfless approach. So we can't thank her enough.
Absolutely echo that, Dr. Vivian. Thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us. And we do have another question that came in here. How many participants are expected to enroll, and how long do you predict that will take?
So 33 total across the United States. We have whatever I said, 18 or 19. I can't remember if we're at 18 or 19. So we're more than halfway. I bet we will probably enroll the last patient sometime this fall. And then we have a year from that time point that they will then need to finish.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions come in here, so it looks like we will wrap up a little bit early today. Again, I want to thank you all for this incredibly informative discussion. I just really appreciate you taking time out of your busy lives to do this, Sarah, Dr. Vivian, and Dr. Wilkie. And again, Dr. Vivian, thank you so much for sharing your personal story with all of us today. Just want to say that, again, I want to remind everyone that the session was recorded. We will be sure to send out a link to the recording following the event today to all of the registrants. And if you just a personal plug for our newsletter at the Clinical Trials Institute, if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in the clinical research community, including more terrific events like this, please do sign up for our newsletter. It's at uwclinicaltrials.org, and we'll be sure to include a link to that in the follow-up email as well.
Kevin, there were a few quick questions that I think there was one important point that even I maybe should have mentioned it. This clinical trial that's happening right now is all paid for. Insurance does not cover it. So Eva doesn't, and her insurance company doesn't pay for it. She doesn't pay for it. It is all covered under this consortium, and it's funded by the National Cancer Institute. So I think when I'm paying my taxes, I actually feel like I'm doing something good because your tax dollars cover this. And the estrogen positive vaccine, I hope we see it at some point in the future. I haven't seen it quite yet, but I hope it's coming down the line.
And I would also like to offer anyone who has specific questions for me about being a participant in a clinical trial or any questions about vaccines to reach out to me. My email address is vivian@wis.edu, or you can just go to the UW website and type my name in and my email address will pop up. I'm willing to answer any questions you have or refer you to Dr. Wilkie or someone that can answer a question that I cannot address.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Vivian. I guess we do have another question that showed up here. Is there a current vaccine for HER2 and triple positive cancer?
There are a lot of clinical trials investigating cancer vaccines for HER2 positive cancers. I will be honest, I would have to look and see if they include the estrogen positivity, i.e. the triple positive. But again, if you put in clinicaltrials.gov and put in HER2 or vaccine, I know there's several in the HER2 space as well as this triple negative space.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, Dr. Vivian, Dr. Wilkie, Sarah, thanks so much for a tremendous program today. I'm looking forward to rewatching it myself. There's a lot I learned a lot today myself, and I hope the folks in attendance did as well. And I want to thank you all who took the time to attend today. And again, feel free to, if you have any questions about the Institute or any of our upcoming programs, please visit uwclinicaltrials.org. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.